Thank you so much for joining us for CBN NewsWatch. I'm Efrem Graham. Ahead today, President Biden heads to the United Nations where he'll criticize Russia's war in Ukraine. Serious questions about the future of the U.S. military. A critical recruiting crisis is underway that puts America's national security at risk.
This could potentially be multi-generational in terms of its impact. Young recruits today become our young and senior leaders of tomorrow. And so if you can't develop them today, you have a gap in leadership tomorrow.
Strong reactions to the president's statements about COVID.
The pandemic is over. We still have a problem with COVID. We're still doing a lot of work on it. But the pandemic is over.
But do health experts and even the president's own administration agree? The U.S. and Europe are pushing new green energy programs, but developing countries need the current forms of energy to grow.
In a country like India, if you see, there are more than 300 million people in poverty, and for them to come up in life, there has to be an overall economic development in the society, and that can happen only when there is a robust energy sector.
We'll look at how keeping fossil fuels out of third world countries is condemning millions of people to remain in poverty. And our Studio 5 conversation with Kirk Cameron and the Kendrick Brothers about the true story of the pro-life film Lifemark, dealing with an adopted young man who's looking to meet his birth parents.
Kirk Cameron gives us a call, and he said, guys, you got to watch this short documentary I just saw. It grabbed my heart. It's so powerful.
And we'll hear from that young man and his mother. All those stories and more today on CBN NewsWatch.
This is CBN NewsWatch.
We begin this half hour with President Biden traveling to the United Nations today, where he is set to make the case to the world leaders that Russia's, quote, naked aggression, unquote, in Ukraine is an affront to what the United Nations stands for. The president is looking to rally allies to stand firm in supporting Ukrainians' resistance. Biden's speech comes as Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered a partial mobilization of reservists in Russia, a move that appeared to be an admission that Moscow's war against Ukraine isn't going well after nearly 7 months of fighting. It is the first mobilization in Russia since World War II and comes amid recent battlefield losses for the Kremlin's forces. While Putin is calling up more forces, the U.S. military faces concerns of its own. A crucial recruiting crisis is underway that puts America's national security at risk. Unfortunately, a record number of young people are ineligible to serve. Others have decided they have no desire. Here's CBN's national security correspondent, Caitlin Burke.
The U.S. Army is on track to have its worst recruiting year since Vietnam, a shortfall that could have implications for decades.
This could potentially be multi-generational in terms of its impact. Young recruits today become our young and senior leaders of tomorrow. And so if you can't develop them today, you have a gap in leadership tomorrow.
Right now, the Army has only reached about 52% of its recruiting goal for the current fiscal year, which ends later this month. Other military branches are closer to their targets, although attracting and retaining talent is a challenge across the board.
We reduced our pilot shortage by 250 airmen, yet we still have over 1,600 pilot vacancies.
Military leaders say many factors contribute to the shortage: the pandemic, the labor market, even competition from the private sector. The biggest problem, however, is a shrinking recruitment pool. Of the age-eligible population, less than a quarter are even qualified to serve.
That has to do with criminality, can't necessarily pass the initial intake tests, and or mental health conditions, things like that, and obesity and physicality.
I believe as a culture, we need to get back to a society of service. I think we need to look at national service. You don't have to be in uniform to serve. You could be in inner city tutoring, national parks, rural medicine. But how do we get our youngest folks kind of, frankly, off the couch, off the video games and out serving each other and learning those life skills of teamwork, discipline, followership, leadership?
Florida Representative Mike Waltz believes stronger leadership is needed from the Pentagon, pointing to issues such as vaccine mandates.
The National Guard is on the verge of potentially kicking out, discharging 20 to 25,000 National Guardsmen and women who have concerns about the vaccine. And look, I get the notion of a soldier's given an order, they have to follow the order. But also as leaders, we have to constantly reevaluate our orders and do they still make sense?
Colonel Matthew Amidon, Director of Veterans and Military Families at the George W. Bush Institute, says all sectors working together are needed to solve this recruitment crisis.
This is not just a Department of Defense challenge. This is a Veterans Affairs challenge. This is a community, a philanthropy, a nonprofit, and the corporate sector challenge as well. Everybody needs a seat at the table, because really at the core, what you are doing is by raising your right hand, maintaining and advancing our democracies.
Congressman Waltz pointed out that the Biden administration's student debt relief program could be another blow to the military's recruiting efforts, one of the major rewards for serving being a free education through the GI Bill. Waltz says that's not nearly as incentivizing if the government is putting people through college. Caitlin Burke, CBN News, Washington.
Here's a question many people are asking. Is the COVID-19 pandemic over? It comes after President Biden said it during a 60 Minutes interview Sunday evening, and he quickly faced sharp pushback for that comment. As medical reporter Lori Johnson explains, health experts have different ideas about what the president meant by that and where we now stand.
By declaring the pandemic over, President Biden caught a number of people off guard and wondering how Americans will respond to that statement. The president made the comment during his first one-on-one interview in months.
We're still doing a lot of work on it. But the pandemic is over. If you notice, no one's wearing masks. Everybody seems to be in pretty good shape. And so I think it's changing, and I think this is a perfect example of it.
Putting the pandemic in the rearview mirror raises questions about continued vaccine mandates for the military and government workers. It could also make it difficult to pass the more than $22 billion COVID relief bill for vaccines, tests, and PPEs.
We will continue to make sure that we have the supply that the population needs, and with the help of Congress, we'll be able to do that way into next year.
And with U.S. deaths topping 400 daily, doctors warn against developing a false sense of security.
Not to quote Rambo, but it's not over. It's not over. And the bottom line is this, that it's close. We're better than we were. In fact, the World Health Organization leadership has said, look, we're in a very good place. We're getting there. But I wouldn't exactly say it's over.
Experts say if it hasn't already happened, COVID will be downgraded to an endemic like the flu, which kills about 30,000 Americans a year.
There will always be some people that succumb to anything, whether it be the flu or another kind of viral illness, but COVID-19 will be relegated more to that level and not a pandemic where no one has immunity.
Doctors see COVID boosters becoming an annual recommendation like the flu shot.
People who follow Christ, it's important that we do that, one, without fear. In other words, we know who holds tomorrow, and even if that tomorrow is terrible and ugly, our trust is in him. And the second, though, is that I think we should also do that with others' consideration. And I think we have learned that, I hope, during COVID, that my germs don't just affect me, for example, and I think we should be considerate and err on the side of caution and love.
So while health experts may debate whether COVID is a pandemic or an endemic, one thing is certain, it's here to stay. Lori Johnson, CBN News.
Coming up, the push for green energy is leaving millions around the world in the dark because developing nations need fossil fuels to lift them out of poverty. See why the Western world's dream of going green is hurting the poorest of the poor when we come back. Developing nations around the world need energy to grow their economies. The biggest roadblock is the push for green energy here in the U.S. and Europe. Keeping fossil fuels out of third world countries is condemning millions to remain in poverty. Dale Hurd is on the story.
A regular event at UN climate summits is a special presentation by indigenous groups or representatives from the developing world warning that climate change is a threat to their way of life.
The world leaders have to be more aggressive and rapidly keep fossil fuels in the ground. That's bottom line.
Talk to leaders from the developing world, however, and you hear a different concern: how being forced to use green energy will make it even harder for millions to escape poverty. Uganda's president wrote in the Wall Street Journal that Africa can't sacrifice its future prosperity for Western climate goals. Africa will have to use fossil fuels as it makes the transition. In Ghana, Peter Bismarck with the Institute for Liberty and Policy Innovation says what Africans need most is reliable energy, not what he calls diversity, his term for green energy.
Africans are basically not interested in the diversity. They are much interested in the efficiency and the reliability of energy before they look at diversity.
Vijay Jairaj of the CO2 Coalition says it's the same situation in India.
In a country like India, if you see, there are more than 300 million people in poverty. And for them to come up in life, there has to be an overall economic development in the society. And that can happen only when there is a robust energy sector.
One critic said the idea that some of the poorest people on Earth can suddenly switch to hydrogen-based green technology is absurd.
Remote areas of within African countries are much interested in getting anything to light their refrigerators and charge their phones and watch television.
Not only do wealthy nations want developing nations to switch to green energy, they're forcing the issue. The U.S., Britain, and European nations have vowed to cut off public financing for new fossil fuel projects by the end of the year, including those in developing nations, even as wealthy nations continue to use fossil fuels, including African natural gas. Magat Wade is director of the African Center for Prosperity.
What's the difference between you, German, who when you need fossil fuels and you realize you still need it, you're going for it, yet you're telling me, the Africans, we can't do it? Is it because I'm black? Is it because we're idiots? Is it because we're inferior? We want to become prosperous nations. We want to become prosperous people. But for that to happen, access to reliable and affordable energy is central, is key.
The reality in developing countries is that the situation here is far worse than what is being portrayed in the media in the West. The countries here are already struggling to keep up with the energy demand. And for them to experiment with green technologies would be not so wise, especially when people are still living in the dark. Hospitals are still struggling to get an electricity connection, and when we live in poverty.
Sudanese-British billionaire businessman Mo Ibrahim, in a conference call this year with European Union leaders, said that Europe's refusal to fund fossil fuels in Africa is morally indefensible.
We found it, a little bit strange when Europe is wallowing in gas, Russian gas, African gas, putting gas projects everywhere. And when it comes to Africa, no. You are using African gas and you're denying us to use African gas. I mean, that is morally indefensible.
The experts we talked to said they would welcome green energy if their nations could afford it and rely on it. But they can't. Forcing it on them now amounts to what some are calling green colonialism. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Still ahead, our Studio 5 conversation about the true story of the film Lifemark. We talked to producer Kirk Cameron and the Kendrick Brothers about the movie dealing with a young man who is looking to meet his birth parents. We'll bring you that interview right after this. Welcome back to CBN NewsWatch. Lifemark is the inspirational true story of a young man's journey to meet his birth parents. It's the 8th film for the Kendrick Brothers, but their first true story and Fathom Events' first 7-day premiere to run in more than 1,500 theaters, and has just recently been extended. It opened at number 3 and stayed in the top 5 its very first weekend. We sat down with its star and producer, Kirk Cameron, along with the Kendrick Brothers.
Melissa, what are you going to do?
We got the call. We have a son.
Are you sure?
You want to talk to him?
I don't think he'd want to talk to me.
I know that he is 18, but why now?
Is that your birth mom?
She wants to meet.
Really?
How did you come to the Lifemark story?
Kirk Cameron gives us a call, and he said, guys, you got to watch this short documentary I just saw. It grabbed my heart. It's so powerful. Stephen and I watched it. It was called I Lived on Parker Avenue, and it told the story of Melissa, in that she is 18 years old, now an unexpected pregnancy, and she's got to figure out what to do. And so she walks out of the abortion clinic, places her baby for adoption. And when David turns, I think, 19, he has a chance to meet Melissa, his biological mother.
Do you remember asking to see that when you were about 8 years old?
How old were they?
I think she was 18, and he was 17.
I honestly had no idea that this many people were wanting to adopt.
We actually have the real footage, because this really happened, of them meeting for the very first time after 19 years, and he wraps her up in this loving hug and says, thank you, thank you, thank you for my life. I love my family, and it's because of you and the brave choice that you made.
Imagine how scared she must have been. She was pregnant when she graduated, and then the decision to place you for adoption.
God, if you're there, please protect him and watch over him.
We see the scene play out in the film. What's it been like for you, real life, this reunion?
In the real life reunion was, wow. I mean, I held him once the day he was born, and then it took 19 years to be able to hug him again. So
when you held him again, what were you thinking?
How much I loved him and how grateful I was that life was chosen.
Must have been the hardest decision of her entire life.
This movie doesn't just present one person's perspective, but when you see this issue of the crisis of a potential unwanted pregnancy and what to do, you get into the mind and the heart of these afraid teenagers, but also you follow the journey of this child up through his life, that he loves his life.
Are you okay with people knowing that you're adopted?
Yes. I would have never thought that I would ever share the fact that I was adopted in public, yet alone be okay with a documentary and a movie. So God works in mysterious ways, and he's why I'm here today, and I'm just glad to be a part of this story and now this movie.
And I'm so glad that she made the choice that she did.
It's beautiful how that one courageous decision, when everything was against this birth mom, how it blesses so many people later on because she chose love over selfishness or discomfort.
Looking at this, I think your 8th film, what's been the difficulty in getting this one out?
When we first decided to make a movie about a young woman who chose adoption over abortion, the studios that would normally distribute our films said it was a very touchy subject and that they did not want to release the film. So we prayed about it. We said, God, what would you have us do? And we felt led, go ahead and tell the story. It's a true story. It's hard to argue with a true story. So we made the film, and then the Lord opened the door to go through Fathom. So we're very grateful that even when all the doors looked like they were shut, God still opened the door He wanted us to walk through.
Where have you seen God's handprint on this project?
Oh, wow. We screened the movie to 600 people at a church. There was a gentleman there who's 32 years old. He's got tears in his eyes. He said, after watching Lifemark, the Lord said, you can do this. You can do it. He said, I'm going home right now to tell my wife I'm ready. We're going to adopt.
What if we contacted the adoption agency one more time?
We want to compassionately and lovingly say we understand both sides, but at the same time, here is a true story of what it looked like for these families. What could it look like in other scenarios?
You are an executive producer as well as one of the stars. What connected you to this story? What happened?
This movie has meaning to me on a personal level as an adoptive father, but then also it's a true story that I think the nation needs to hear at this time, being so divided over so many things.
He feels perfect.
I think Lifemark is really going to give people a new perspective about the options that are available and give them a new perspective on the preciousness and the value of life. This comes at a time where, in our lifetime, we never would have imagined that Roe versus Wade would be gone. And now people are trying to decide, what do we do in our state? And we're just so excited that people's hearts and minds, I think, are going to be changed when they see this true story that results in so much hope, so much life, so much inspiration and encouragement, and that it's not just an issue of a mother's decision, but it's the issue of many, many people and generations that are impacted by one choice.
Do you know what you'd say to her?
Thank you.
There's more to come from Lifemark in the coming weeks, including a Bible study. Be sure to stay tuned. We'll have more on the story as well on this evening's Studio 5, along with a look at a new book from news anchor and author Ainsley Earhart. She joins us. Plus, we've got a look back at a musical festival real close to our home and to our hearts. Be sure to join us for Studio 5 this evening on the CBN News Channel. It begins at 8:30. You can also find it on the CBN News app. Coming up, a record number of Jewish pilgrims flocking to visit one of the most famous locations from biblical times in Jerusalem. We're going to tell you about that when we come back. Stay with us. A landmark number at one of the famous holy sites from biblical history. Jews visited the Temple Mount in Jerusalem more than 50,000 times over the past year, the most since the Roman Empire destroyed the second biblical Jewish temple in 70 AD. That is according to new numbers released by Beyonde Nu, an Israeli organization that works to bring Jews to the Temple Mount. The 50,000 figure represents the number of visits, not the total number of visitors. The group expects the number to keep rising over the next month when Jewish pilgrims from around the world flock to Jerusalem to observe the biblical holy days, which begin with the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, this Sunday, and will end on October 17th. Beyondu's director says the goal is for 100,000 pilgrims next year. Well, it is time now for your Wednesday word, and today's word is journey. Consider this: life is about so much more than reaching that destination. The journey to it, the journey to that destination is meant to be enjoyed as well. Fully live in the moment that you're in. There is purpose in it. With that word, make this a wonderful Wednesday, and be sure to have yourself a wonderful week, living and experiencing every single moment. Well, that is a wrap for this edition of CBN NewsWatch. You can always find more of our programs on the CBN News Channel. You can find them there at any time, as well as online, cbnnews.com. We'd love to know what you think about the stories you've seen here today or any day. You can email us. We've got the address right there at the bottom of the screen, newswatch@cbn.com. Thank you for watching. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Goodbye and God bless.